if one day you were kicked out of the very chair you paid to sit on just because you didn't look like someone with money, how would you react? Get angry, protest, or just silently watch others expose their prejudices? On a Skyjet Airlines flight, in the brightly lit first-class cabin, Daniel Cole, a high school teacher, boarded the plane with his first-class ticket in his life. He just wanted to enjoy a peaceful journey after years of hard work. But to Ava Monroe, the flight attendant, he didn't look like the person who should be sitting there. One look, one sentence, and the entire first-class cabin became a place to expose the gap between dignity and prejudice. If it were you, when you were insulted by dozens of strange looks, what would you choose? Stay silent to keep your dignity, or respond to demand justice? Sometimes, it is in the moments when we are most despised that our true character is revealed. And today, you will witness a silent justice where power is reversed without a shout. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to join me in the story. Flight attendant refuses a seat to a school teacher, not knowing he owns the airline. The loudspeakers on the Skyjet Airlines flight blared out like the heartbeat of a quiet morning. Outside, the March sky was clear, the sunlight streaming through the airport windows like a pale yellow paint. Passengers lined up, some busy, some leisurely, all waiting to take off to very different destinations. But no one knew there was one person about to experience the most important flight of his life. Daniel Cole stood in the middle of the crowd, holding a ticket printed with the words "First Class." A tall, dark-skinned man of color, with a gentle but tough face, the face of someone who had spent many years teaching. His suit was not new, but neat. His leather shoes were polished to the point of being a mirror. He was not rich, just a high school teacher who had saved for years to reward himself with this special trip, his first vacation after nearly 20 years of teaching. For Daniel, first class is not just a seat, but a small symbol of quiet effort. He once told his students, "Sometimes it's not where you fly that counts, but how confidently you board your flight." Little did he know that today, that very lesson would come back to test him in a cruel way. In the cabin, Ava Monroe, Skyjet's chief flight attendant, was checking each row with her usual style fast, neat, and flawless. She is the kind of person who believes that order is a measure of competence, and competence is a measure of value. With more than a decade of flying with the airline, Ava is used to identifying correct customers as soon as they board the plane. When she saw Daniel entering the first-class cabin, she only glanced at him briefly. Then her professional smile immediately disappeared. She walked over, her voice soft but cold. "Sorry, sir. This cabin is for first-class passengers only." Daniel stopped. A little surprised, he held up the ticket, politely. "Yes, I'm in the right place." Ava took the ticket, glanced at it briefly, then returned it with a forced smile. "There must be some mistake. Let me double-check. Please sit in the back seat, in economy, until it is confirmed." Her voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to make a few nearby passengers look up. A few glances passed over Daniel, a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Some frowned. Others looked away silently. In that atmosphere, the silence suddenly became heavier than the insult. Daniel looked around. He didn't want to make a fuss. He knew that, in this world, there were arguments that only made people lose their self-worth. He nodded slightly. "Okay." Then he carefully picked up his bag and walked down to the economy class. With the other people looking at him with half contempt and half compassion, No one said anything, but everyone understood what had just happened. In first class. Ava returned to her work, her face as stony as ever. She saw nothing wrong. She believed she was maintaining service standards that sometimes the inappropriate people had to be weeded out to protect the premium customer experience. But in the back, Daniel sat silently, his folded ticket still clutched in his palm, not out of anger, but out of a sense of being stripped of dignity without a chance to justify it. He looked out the window, the light reflecting off the glass blurring his vision. Whether from the sun or from frustration, he couldn't tell. Outside, staff continued to greet guests. Inside, a small crack in the belief in fairness had begun to form. In the service cabin, Rachel Carter, a young, new flight attendant, looked at Ava hesitantly. "Are you sure he really sat in the wrong seat?" Ava shrugged. "Look at him, Rachel. Have you ever seen a teacher-looking guy sitting in first class?" Rachel was silent. The words made her feel cold. She remembered her first training session, where the instructor had said on an airplane, "All passengers are equal once they have a ticket." But, looking at Ava, she understood that reality is not always as fair as theory. The cabin stabilized, and the passengers settled in. The engines began to roar, a low rumble like the whisper of an approaching storm. Little did Ava know, while she believed she had everything under control, a chain reaction was beginning to set in motion silently, slowly, but surely. In the last row of economy class, Daniel took out his phone and sent a short message to his assistant-moved seat. Flight attendant did not check ticket properly. That seemingly harmless message was the first spark of a power shift. Ava, on the other hand, continued walking through the first-class cabin, her head held high, adjusting her scarf. She had no idea that the man she had just pushed into the economy row would be the one who would decide her career fate, and that of the entire airline. No one in that cabin knew that a simple message would shake the entire power system on this plane, and the truth, as usual, would take off later than everyone else. But once it was up, no one could bring it down. The plane was settled, the soft yellow light covering the first-class seats like a curtain to cover the small but heavy collisions. Ava Monroe returned to the front of the cabin, the ticket Daniel Cole had given her earlier in her hand. She looked at it again, not really reading it, just glancing at it like someone looking at a flyer dropped at their feet. The bold words, "First Class." Seat 1A were still there, but Ava could only see the name Daniel Cole, not a businessman, not a regular, a strange, empty name. She took a deep breath and smiled faintly. "Sir, I think there is a mistake. This is not your place." Daniel looked at her, his eyes gentle but firm. "There is no mistake. I bought this ticket with my own card." Ava frowned slightly. She didn't like overly confident people, especially when they didn't look like they belonged in the front row. "I just need to make sure," she said, her voice feigning politeness. "Please stand up and move to the back of the cabin." Daniel remained seated. He looked out the window, saw his reflection in the glass, a dark-skinned man in a suit, his hands on his knees, calm amid the undercurrent of gaze. He replied, softly, "I don't think that's necessary. This ticket is perfectly valid." The sentence was not loud, but enough to make the space between the two people thick. A passenger in the next seat glanced at her, then pretended to bend down to fasten her seatbelt. The woman behind her coughed softly, as if to break the silence that had stretched on for too long. Ava could feel the eyes on her, and that made her feel even more compelled to assert her authority. She clenched the ticket in her hand. "Speaking faster and colder, sir. I need your cooperation. If you don't move, I'll have to call airport security." Daniel turned and looked straight into her eyes. There was no anger in his gaze, only something like regret. He replied in a low, restrained voice, "If you really believe I shouldn't be sitting here, then do what you think is right." A moment passed. Ava stood still, saying nothing. She knew she had been given power, but she had no idea how to use it. The feeling of power mixed with fear made her heart beat in two different rhythms. Then she signaled to another flight attendant, "Get him into economy. I'll check with the system." Daniel stood up. No one in the compartment said anything, but some watched. Others looked down, pretending to be busy with their phones. The atmosphere in the compartment became stifling not from lack of oxygen, but from the awkwardness of those who witnessed injustice but lacked the courage to intervene. A child in the front row turned around, looked at Daniel, and asked his mother, "Mom, why did that man have to get off?" The mother whispered, "It's okay, son. Maybe he sat in the wrong seat." Daniel heard. He smiled softly, a gentle but painful smile. He knew the child would grow up hearing stories like that and owns believing that the less powerful were always at fault. At the front of the cabin, Ava returned to her seat, entering information into her handheld. The system took a few seconds to respond. She typed in her ticket number, then her flight number, but the network was slow, the connection spotty. She sighed, pressed the button again. In that moment, part of her hoped the system would report an error so she could say, "See, I was right." But the words, "first class," verified appeared, clear, unmistakable. She looked at the screen, then at the back of the economy cabin. A rush of blood rushed through her heart, but not from embarrassment, but from threatened pride. She told herself, "It can't be. It must be a technical error." In Ava's mind, there was no room for the possibility that she was wrong. In the economy cabin, Daniel sat still, the light reflecting off his face, highlighting his composure. He opened his phone and typed "moved seat." Flight attendant did not check ticket properly. A second later, the message returned. "Send flight number. Sit tight. This isn't over." He read, eyes slightly closed, not angry, not relieved, just the silence of one who knows that justice does not need to be shouted to be heard. In the service cabin, Rachel Carter kept looking at Ava. "Are you sure you need to do this? His ticket is clearly first class." Ava didn't turn around, just replied over her shoulder, "You're young. When you've been in this business longer, you'll understand who really bought that ticket." Her voice was eerily calm. The statement was more than an explanation, it was a social indictment. Rachel was silent. She knew that if she argued, she would be seen as unprofessional. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. The roar of the engines intensified as the plane began to taxi down the runway. For a brief moment, the atmosphere in the cabin seemed to freeze as if everyone knew they had just witnessed something wrong. But no one had the courage to say anything. Ava glanced at Daniel's empty seat, where the small towel he'd left on the armrest was still there, a small mark of someone who had just been repositioned. She turned away, trying not to think about it, but the image stuck in her mind like a black ink stain on the perfect white background she'd always tried to keep. Up ahead, in the cockpit, Captain James Adler received an urgent message from headquarters. He opened it and saw a short message: confirmed passenger Daniel Cole is on board. If so, report back immediately. He frowned, not understanding what was going on, but as he continued reading the note, his eyes changed completely. He looked up, the green light reflecting in his pupils, his voice hoarse as he called over the intercom. "Ava, did you just ask passenger Daniel Cole to move?" The cabin still had no idea what was coming, but in the quietest place, among the clouds, a truth was preparing to land. No one in first class knew that a single message from the cockpit was about to turn that little world upside down. And this time, the person in charge didn't have to raise his voice. He just had to say one sentence. The engine noise gradually calmed down, and the plane reached cruising altitude. Everything looked peaceful, but inside Daniel Cole, a storm was brewing slowly. He sat in the last row of economy class, among passengers jostling for luggage space and ordering drinks. The smell of fast food, the loud laughter, and the cramped space between the 2 rows of seats made him feel suffocated. Not because of the seat, but because of how he got there. He looked down at the ticket in his hand. The words "First Class," 1A were still clearly printed. He flipped it over and over, as if wondering if he had seen wrong. But he hadn't, and he didn't understand why he was trying to find fault with himself for something he hadn't done wrong. A man sitting next to him, with silver hair and a gentle face, glanced at the ticket in Daniel's hand and asked softly, "Did you get switched seats?" Daniel smiled, a smile as thin as ice on a lake. It seemed so. The other man nodded, silent. He understood, but did not want to say more. On planes, there were some things that were best left unsaid because people believed that if they did not speak, they would not be implicated. Daniel opened his phone. The network on the plane was weak, but still enough to send a text message. His fingers typed slowly, "Moved seat." Flight attendant did not check ticket properly. He paused before pressing send. Part of him still wanted to believe that this was just a misunderstanding, that when they landed, Ava would come and apologize, and everything would be over. But deep down, he knew some misunderstandings don't come from confusion, but from prejudice. The message was sent, lost in the weak signal. He looked out the window, where the sky was fading to silver. The clouds below were layered like calm waves. He sighed, not out of anger, but out of pity for this world where people still judged each other by their shirt, their wallet, their skin color. The phone vibrated. A text message came in almost immediately. "Send flight number. Sit tight. This isn't over." He read slowly, word by word. The sentences were short and sharp, like those of someone used to handling crises. It was a message from Mark Bennett, his longtime assistant, the man who had been by his side through every decision at Skyjet Airlines. Daniel pursed his lips, his eyes narrowing. A moment of confusion passed through him, but then he put the phone in his pocket and leaned back in his chair. He didn't want to make a scene. He didn't want to turn this into a show of revenge. He just wanted to sit quietly like someone who knows that sometimes silence is the highest form of strength. In first class, Ava Monroe walked the aisles, serving passengers with a fake smile. But deep down, she felt uncomfortable. She didn't know why the image of that black man kept popping into her head. His calm eyes made her feel like she was looking in a mirror. She shook her head and told herself, "Just an inappropriate passenger." I followed the procedure, but strangely, Following the procedure had never made her feel so relieved. Another flight attendant, Rachel Carter, saw Ava standing silently for a few seconds at the coffee bar. Rachel said nothing, but her eyes flickered with concern. There was something about the way Ava was acting that made her uneasy. In the back, Daniel closed his eyes. The engine hummed steadily like a heartbeat. He remembered the first lesson he ever taught his students. A smart person never lets others decide his worth. The words echoed in his mind now like a reminder. He didn't need to prove himself right. He just needed to be steadfast in the truth. The light outside the window turned bronze dusk was approaching. In the light, Daniel smiled slightly. He didn't know what Mark was doing, or what the message would lead to, but he believed in the man, just as he believed that all truths, however obscured, would eventually find their way to light. A few rows up, the waitress serving drinks asked Daniel, "Would you like anything?" "Sir." He shook his head. "No. Thank you." His voice was soft, polite. There was no resentment. The girl nodded and walked away. But when she turned back, she looked at him a little longer. Perhaps she saw something else in his eyes, a calmness not of someone being humiliated, but of someone waiting to observe. Time passed slowly. The plane passed through thick clouds. The cabin lights dimmed. Ava stood at the front, adjusting her hair, checking the VIP list. As her eyes scanned the row of names, her heart stopped Daniel Cole, founder and owner, Skyjet Airlines. A second of silence. Then, two. Her heart was racing, her face pale. She gripped the list so tightly her knuckles turned white. She tried to swallow, her eyes looking towards the economy cabin where the man was sitting, calm and quiet, not knowing that in just a few minutes the entire cabin would be in a power reversal. Ava took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure, but her breathing was labored, like someone had a hand on her chest. She didn't know what to fear more, the truth about to come out, or the way the truth would punish her with silence. In the back seat, Daniel remained seated. He opened his phone and reread Mark's message. "This isn't over yet." He sighed softly and put the phone down. No one in the cabin knew that this simple man was the heart of the airline they were flying on. But he didn't need anyone to know, because justice, to him, never needed to be paraded. It was just a matter of waiting for the right moment and letting the truth take flight. In the service bay, Rachel Carter began to feel uneasy. She didn't know what was going on. But one thing was clear, something in Ava's eyes had changed, from arrogance to fear. And that was the first moment. Conscience began to awaken. The mid-flight service area is a place passengers rarely see a narrow space. White light, the sound of the engines like steady rain. There, two women stood facing each other. A small conversation, but enough to expose two different worlds in the same uniform. Rachel Carter wiped her coffee cup, her hands shaking slightly, not from fatigue, but from something stuck in her chest. She had seen it all, from Ava Monroe's suspicious look when she stopped Daniel, to the moment he silently walked down to economy without a word. She couldn't erase the image from her mind. Ava was sorting through the passenger list as if nothing had happened. Her voice was calm, even, and emotionless. "Rachel, next time you see someone walk into first class, take a closer look. He doesn't look like someone who flies first class." Rachel looked up, startled by the way Ava said it, as light as a breeze, but it left a scar in her heart. She asked again, her voice low but clear. "You mean, you don't look like someone?" "Ava, not like someone with money, or not like someone respected. Ava paused for a moment, then curled her lips, a smile that was a mixture of confidence and contempt. You're young. You'll understand. In this profession, just by looking, you can tell who belongs where. Rachel looked straight at her, her eyes filled with disbelief. What if I'm wrong? Ava was silent for a few seconds, then turned away, avoiding his gaze. She didn't like being challenged. She simply replied, her voice slow, "Well, I hope that person is understanding enough not to make a big deal out of it." The words stung like a knife. Rachel said nothing more, just watched Ava leave. But something inside her crumbled the belief that her colleagues maintained a line between professionalism and prejudice. Rachel returned to the counter, glass in hand, eyes on the economy cabin. From here, she could see Daniel's back, straight, calm, unmoving. He was still sitting there, as still as a rock in a rushing stream. She didn't understand why the man wasn't angry. She would have reacted, argued, tried to prove something. But he didn't. For a moment, Rachel felt ashamed, not of Ava, but of herself of standing there, of watching what happened, and of doing nothing. A voice in my head said, if I stay silent in the face of wrongdoing, am I any different from the wrongdoer? She turned back to Ava, who was still serving drinks to the customers in the front row. Ava was smiling, graceful, professional, as if nothing embarrassing had happened. Only Rachel knew that her composure was built on the belief that she was always right because she was in a higher position. While clearing the glasses, Rachel asked softly, "Ava, have you ever thought maybe he is someone important?" Ava laughed softly, her voice tinged with sarcasm. "Rachel, you're so naive. Important people never travel alone, and they don't buy tickets with their personal cards. Trust me, he's just some teacher." Rachel was silent. She knew Ava didn't understand, or maybe didn't want to. But she sensed one thing clearly: Ava's arrogance wasn't natural. It was nurtured by a system that was too used to classifying people by their looks, their voices, their skin color. The plane rocked slightly as it passed through the cold air. Rachel held onto the table, still looking toward the economy cabin. Daniel had just closed his eyes, his hands clasped together. He wasn't sleeping. He was waiting. In that dim light, Rachel suddenly understood. There are people who don't need to speak up to make others rethink how they treat the world. And what scared her most, she sensed his silence was stronger than any of Ava's excuses. About 10 minutes later, Ava returned to the counter and found Rachel standing motionless. "What's wrong? Don't let your emotions get in the way of your work, okay?" Rachel replied softly, "If work makes you lose all your emotions, then what is there to be called human anymore?" "Sister." Ava frowned, but said nothing. Rachel's answer made her uneasy, but she didn't want to show it. She just poured more coffee, trying to act cool. Outside the window, the sky began to darken. The cabin was silent, except for the sound of the engines and the beating of each person's heart. Rachel looked up and caught Daniel's eyes on her. No words, just a slight nod as if he knew she was the only one who realized what had happened. The moment was brief, but it was enough for Rachel to understand that sometimes justice begins with just one person daring to feel uncomfortable with what is wrong. Ava kept replaying the conversation over and over in her head, not like someone flying first class. She wondered if she was becoming the very thing she hated: someone who judged people by their appearance. But she didn't dare dwell on it. Instead of looking at the truth, she chose to look away, as if that would make the mistake go away. But the error didn't go away. It just waited, silently, behind the cockpit glass, where a message was about to be transmitted, ready to overturn everything. In the cockpit, Captain James Adler had just received an urgent message from headquarters. When he read the name Daniel Cole, his eyes darkened, and in that moment, the quiet plane became a place where power began to change direction. The atmosphere on the Skyjet Airlines flight was like the surface of a winter lake calm, but underneath was a thin layer of ice that was beginning to crack. Little did anyone know that a short text message would change the entire power structure on this plane. In economy class, Daniel Cole flipped open his phone. The screen's light reflected off his face, quiet and deep. He typed a few simple words. Flight attendant name Monroe. That was it. No complaints, no angry tone. The message was like a pebble dropped into a still pond. It didn't create big waves, but it disturbed the bottom. Daniel put the phone down on the tray table and leaned his head back in his chair. His breathing was slow and even. But there was something indescribable in his eyes. The weariness of someone who had seen history repeat itself too many times. He didn't want revenge. He just wanted people to see what they refused to see. The price of silence is sometimes not loss. It's waiting for the world to make its own mistakes. In the cockpit, the green light reflected on Captain James Adler's face. He was scanning the passenger information board when an urgent message appeared on the screen, marked with a priority code from headquarters. He frowned and opened it. Skyjet HQ. Urgent message. Confirmation of passenger Daniel Cole on flight SJ204. If so, report immediately. Captain Adler looked at the words, his smile fading. He had flown for Skyjet for nearly 10 years and had only heard the name at high-level meetings, where people talked about the founder who saved the airline from bankruptcy. A man everyone on staff knew about, but no one had ever met in person. His heart beat faster. He tapped into the intercom, re-entering the passenger list. The 8th line appeared clearly: Daniel Cole, seat 1A, verified first class. And next to it is a small note: priority clearance, owner account. Captain Adler looked up, his eyes meeting the co-pilot. Lieutenant Parker, who was studying the weather chart. "Parker," he said, his voice low, "we have Daniel Cole on board." Parker turned, slightly startled. "You mean Daniel Cole?" Adler nodded, his gaze heavy as lead. "That's him." A moment of silence passed. There was no laughter in the cockpit, only the low whine of the jet engines outside. Captain Adler opened the intercom and entered the code for the chief flight attendant. A small beep sounded. His voice was steady and controlled. "Ava Monroe. This is the captain. Can you confirm that you have requested that passenger, Daniel Cole, be removed from first class on the other end?" Ava Monroe was pouring drinks for a passenger. The captain's voice made her pause. She pressed the answer button, trying to keep her voice calm. "Yes, Captain. That passenger is in the wrong seat. I'm checking the information." There was a pause. Then the captain's voice, low and cold, rang out. "No further check-in required. Monroe. Passenger Daniel Cole is the owner of Skyjet Airlines." Ava's wine glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor. It was a small sound, but enough to make several passengers turn. She stood still, her face pale, her hands shaking. The sounds around her faded as if the world had suddenly shrunk in a moment of humiliation and horror. Rachel saw everything. She rushed forward and gently placed her hand on Ava's shoulder. "Sister, are you okay?" Ava didn't answer. She just stared straight ahead. The captain's words echoed in her head like a heartbeat. "Passenger Daniel Cole is the owner of the airline." A chill ran down her spine. She remembered every gesture, every look she had given the man, the way she had said he doesn't look like someone who flies first class, the way she had commanded, so proudly. And now, every word had become her own sentence. In the cockpit, Captain Adler kept his voice calm as he spoke to headquarters. "Confirmed. Daniel Cole is on board. I will handle the situation according to special procedures." The other end of the line only replied briefly. "Ensure he is treated with absolute respect. Any related violations will be recorded directly." Adler nodded and disconnected the call. He understood that this was no longer a small internal matter. It was a matter of the airline's honor. He looked out the window, where the white clouds drifted like silk, and exhaled slowly. He felt a little sad, not because he was afraid of his superiors, but because he knew that all arrogance would eventually come at a price, especially when it was built on prejudice. In the passenger compartment, Ava quietly bent down to pick up the pieces of glass. Rachel held her hand and said softly, "Let me." But Ava gently pushed her away and said softly, "No, this is my fault." That sentence, though small, was the first time she admitted something. Rachel looked at her, saying nothing more. There was no joy in her eyes, only a silent sadness for someone who had just lost herself. Daniel remained seated in the back row. He had no idea that things had begun to move. People were looking for him, panicking about him. But he was just looking out the window. The last rays of sunset shone on his face, a fragile ray of returning justice. He muttered softly, not knowing whether he was talking to himself or to someone else. No one should have to prove they deserve a seat, just because someone else thinks otherwise. He smiled slightly, the smile of someone who once understood that true justice did not need to be proclaimed, it just needed to be realized. An intercom signal broke the silence. Captain Adler requested Ava immediately. When she entered the cockpit, the captain's expression said everything had changed, and from that moment on, power began to return to its rightful place. The cabin was bathed in the dim light of the evening. All the passengers were settled. Only the steady sound of the engines, like the heartbeat of a giant body, could be heard. But in the midst of this peace, a small internal call was shaking the entire power structure of this plane. Ava Monroe stood by the flight attendant's desk, trying to clean up broken glass as the cockpit emergency light flashed red on the dashboard. She wiped her hands and picked up the phone. Her voice remained calm and professional, even as her heart raced from the moment her glass of wine hit the floor. Chief Stewardess Ava Monroe speaking. On the other end of the line, Captain James Adler spoke slowly, his voice even and sharp, unlike usual. "Do you confirm that you asked passenger Daniel Cole to leave first class?" Ava swallowed, her hand tightening on the receiver. Her heart was pounding, but she tried to keep her voice steady. "Yes, sir. The passenger was in the wrong seat. I followed protocol." A long silence passed. No sound, no breathing, only the sound of the engine outside, echoing in like the slow beat of fate. Then Captain Adler's voice rang out, low and cold, but each word fell like lead to her heart. "Passenger Daniel Cole is the owner of Skyjet Airlines." The air seemed to stop. Ava stood frozen, the receiver slipping from her hand and clattering to the counter. The sound was small, but in her head it echoed like thunder. Her body went cold. Her chest tightened. A slight dizziness made her hold on to the table to keep from falling. In that moment, everything inside her collapsed. Her image of a confident, professional, in-control woman evaporated like smoke. She looked back in shock at the economy cabin, where the black man sat quietly, calmly, unaware that his identity had just been announced to the entire crew. In the cockpit, Captain Adler took off his headset and looked at his co-pilot, Parker. He said nothing, just shook his head. Both men understood they had just witnessed one of the worst mistakes in aviation. Not a technical mistake, but a human one. Adler leaned back in his chair, sighed, and looked out at the black sky. He had once told his new students a flight can be technically safe, but morally dangerous when people forget that behind every ticket is a human being. Now, he was witnessing it himself, right on his flight, in the service cabin. Rachel Carter walked over to see Ava still standing there, her face pale. Ava, what happened? Ava didn't look at her. Her voice was shaky and dreamy. Daniel Cole is the owner of the airline. Rachel was stunned. She covered her mouth with her hand, unable to believe her ears. Everything she had suspected was now brutally clear. For a few seconds, the two women stood there, one stripped of her pride, the other newly awakened to the boundaries between right and wrong. Both were silent, except Ava's silence was fear. Rachel's silence was awareness. Ava regained some composure and said softly, almost to herself, "I was just following the rules. I didn't mean anything by it." Rachel looked at her, her voice soft but firm. "No one forces you to judge people by their appearance. What rule teaches you to do that?" The question left Ava speechless. She turned away, her eyes blurring. For the first time, she feared the look her colleagues were giving her, not because of condemnation, but because of disappointment. In the economy cabin, Daniel opened his eyes. He sensed a change in the atmosphere, a rush of footsteps ahead. A flight attendant approached, her face tense, bowing slightly. "Cole, the captain would like to apologize and invite you back to first class." Daniel looked at the flight attendant. His eyes were calm, without a trace of anger. He folded the magazine he was reading and said softly, "No need. I'm fine here." The flight attendant looked at him, confused, as if she couldn't believe his reaction. But Daniel just smiled, the smile of someone who knows that justice doesn't need revenge. He turned back to look out the window, where the distant city lights were beginning to appear from behind the clouds. Everything was peaceful. Only one person on the plane couldn't be calm: Ava Monroe. Ava walked slowly down the hallway, her shoes clicking on the carpet, each step echoing her heartbeat. She stopped at the head of the economy cabin, watching Daniel from afar. He sat there, back straight, eyes still, not looking back at her. Ava tried to speak, but her throat tightened. In her mind, a sentence echoed, the sentence she had said to Rachel before, "Just look, and you know who belongs where." Now she understood. She had looked, but had not seen. She turned and walked, her legs feeling heavy. With each step, she felt herself moving away, not only from first class, but also from the very dignity she had believed was her strength. In the cockpit, Captain Adler contacted headquarters again. Verified, "Mr. Cole is safe. A detailed report will be given after landing." A brief voice replied, "Thank you, Captain. Please handle the situation with utmost respect." Adler nodded slightly and disconnected the communication. He sat still, his gaze distant. He understood that in the sky, true power lay not in the cockpit or first class, but in how people treated each other. A soft announcement sounded, "We'll be landing in a few minutes." But for Ava Monroe, the flight had already ended the moment she heard the words Daniel Cole, and beyond the clouds, justice was quietly preparing to land in its own way. On the cockpit control panel, the cabin contact indicator light was still flashing. Captain James Adler pressed the button, his voice slow and clear, like a bell signaling the inevitable Ava Monroe. "My orders: escort passenger Daniel Cole back to first class. Apologize publicly, and prepare to report to the board upon landing." The sentence ended with a soft click, but to Ava it sounded like a metal door closing behind the offender. She was left speechless. Around her, several flight attendants had heard clearly through the internal headset. Their eyes were on her, not contempt, not pity, simply seeing. They witnessed and were silent. It was that silence that made Ava feel more naked than the scolding. She took a deep breath, told herself to keep going, to do what needed to be done. But with each step, her feet felt glued to the carpet. It was only a short moment, but for Ava, it felt like the longest walk of her flight attendant life from first class to economy. In row 21, Daniel Cole sat still, as if the events around him had nothing to do with him. Little did he know that, just a few meters above, the company's power structure was rotating around his name. When Ava stopped in front of his seat, the air seemed to freeze. A few passengers turned around, curious. Rachel Carter, standing at the head of the aisle, bowed slightly, not intruding, but her eyes saying, "Be honest." Ava bowed slightly. Her voice was hushed, so low it almost faded into the sound of the engine. "Mr. Cole, I'm so sorry. I didn't double-check the information. I was wrong." Daniel looked at her, his eyes calm, without anger. There was a moment of silence. He only asked softly, almost in a whisper, "Why are you so sure that I don't belong there?" The question was short, but it pierced her heart. Ava couldn't answer. She just bowed lower, her voice trembling. "I guessed, and I guessed wrong." Daniel said nothing more. He just nodded. It was a small gesture, but it almost made her cry, for in that stillness, she realized the depth of her mistake. He stood. Rachel approached quietly, inviting him to follow. All the passengers watched, but no one spoke. The atmosphere in the cabin was thick, as if everyone realized they were witnessing something rare, a man once despised being brought back to his rightful place, not by power, but by dignity. Daniel walked slowly. There was no triumph. He did not look around, did not smile, did not appear vindicated. He simply walked as if he were restoring order to the world, an order that should never have been disturbed. When he returned to row 1A, the flight attendant pulled out his chair and poured him some water. He smiled and thanked her, his voice low and soft. "No need to bother. I just want to end the flight in peace." Rachel stood beside him, her head bowed slightly. She understood his silence was the highest form of speech. Behind her, Ava stood still, not daring to look up. She felt every gaze on her. No one said anything. But in that empty space, she heard it most clearly, the sound of collapse. She recalled her time as a new flight attendant, the time she helped an elderly passenger stack his luggage on the shelf, and was told that was the heart of aviation. Now, That heart seemed to have been lost not in a moment of impulse, but over years of believing that her position made her right. Rachel walked up to him gently, without judging, just whispered, "You should apologize to him in front of all the passengers, not because your superiors asked you to, but because it is the right thing to do." Ava nodded slightly, tears welling up in her eyes. She turned around and walked towards the cabin microphone. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was surprisingly clear when it rang out, "Dear passengers, this is Chief Flight Attendant Ava Monroe. I would like to apologize to Mr. Daniel Cole, a first-class passenger, for my unprofessional behavior. I misjudged others, and I hope to be forgiven by you and everyone." No applause, no whispers, just silence, the kind of silence that makes one look inward. Daniel looked up, nodding slightly in her direction. No words, no grand gesture, but everyone understood it was forgiveness. Captain Adler in the cockpit heard the whole thing over the intercom. He said nothing, just took off his helmet and nodded slightly. In that moment, he knew. Justice had taken its course. No shouting needed, just an admission of truth. A moment later, Rachel walked past Daniel. He was looking out the window at the endless black sky. She said softly, her voice sincere, "Thank you for not getting angry." Daniel smiled, his eyes still looking out. "If I get angry, she will only remember me as an angry black man. But if I stay silent, she will remember the lesson." Rachel nodded, her eyes stinging. She understood that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in answering, but in choosing to remain silent at the right time. As the plane continued its journey, first class became peaceful again, but not the same peace as before. It was the kind of peace that comes after a storm when everyone understands their true place in this vast sky. Ava sat in the service cabin, staring into the small mirror that reflected her face. No longer her usual confidence, just a tired woman, wondering, when did I start believing that I have the right to decide other people's worth? She had no answer. She only knew that this flight had become the dividing line between her past and the rest of her life. As the landing sign flashed, Ava looked up. She knew the ground wasn't just where the plane would land. It was where she would face real consequences. And waiting for her below weren't passengers, but justice. The prepare to land sign flashed. But inside Ava Monroe, everything was still in free fall. Not the plane, but her own pride, the thing that had once lifted her up, was now dragging her down. She stood in the cabin, her hands clasped together, feeling the eyes of her colleagues like needles. No one said anything, but she knew they were waiting to see what she would do next. There was no order to hide the truth. There was only one choice left, to be honest, or to disappear into her own silence. Ava took a deep breath, adjusted her uniform collar, and turned to walk down the hallway toward economy. Each step felt like she was stepping over her own shadow. Daniel Cole remained seated in the same row. He was not reading or listening to music. He was just staring out the window at the pale purple of the sunset. The light reflected off his cheeks, making his face look both peaceful and unreadable. Ava stopped beside him. She bowed slightly, her voice small but clear. "Cole, I want to apologize to you, and please return to first class." Daniel turned around. His eyes were neither angry nor gentle. It was just the look of someone who was so used to injustice that he no longer needed to react. He asked slowly, word by word, "Why do you want to take me back now? Before, you were quite sure that I didn't belong there. The question has no knife tip, but the weight of a lifetime of experience. Ava lowered her head even more, her voice trembling. Didn't check the system. I just relied on speculation. Daniel looked at her for a long time. He didn't speak right away, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he wanted the silence to be a mirror. Finally, he asked, his voice as light as a breath, "Do you dare say that in front of everyone Ava looked up, stunned? You mean..." Here, Daniel nodded, calmly. "Yes, because you were wrong in front of them." The usually noisy economy cabin suddenly became strangely quiet. Everyone turned around. They had no idea what was going on, but they could sense something purifying in the air. Ava stood up straight. Her hands were shaking, but her eyes were beginning to regain some courage, the kind of courage born not of power, but of facing the truth. She looked around, then spoke, her voice clearer, echoing through the silent cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Chief Flight Attendant Ava Monroe. I asked Mr. Daniel Cole to leave first class without verifying his identity. I judged him simply because I thought he didn't belong there." Everyone was silent. No applause, no whispers, only the steady hum of the engines, like the breathing of justice being reborn. Ava bowed her head, her voice low and choked. "I'm sorry. I was wrong." Daniel remained silent, saying nothing, but something in his eyes had changed. It was no longer the cold calm, but a touch of kindness, mixed with sadness. He stood up. Every eye in the compartment followed him as he said, his voice low, but carrying farther than any accusation, "I don't need you to apologize for being in the wrong place. But I want you to remember this feeling, the feeling of having someone else decide your worth just because they think they're right." He paused, then added very slowly, "Today, you call me sir. But when you think of me as a teacher, you just call me he. I'm still the same person, just in a different way." Ava bit her lip, tears welling up in her eyes, but she didn't wipe them away. Not because she was weak, but because for the first time she allowed herself to truly feel ashamed. Daniel nodded slightly, stepped forward, where Rachel was waiting to lead him back to first class. Before leaving, he turned back and whispered just enough for Ava to hear, just enough for her to remember, "Your job isn't to judge who deserves to fly first class. It's to make sure everyone gets the same treatment when they're in the same sky." Ava stood there, watching him go. The humiliation remained, but something else was rising beneath either realization. The truth didn't kill her, she realized. It just stripped away the shell she'd worn to hide her fear of being looked down upon. Rachel stepped closer and whispered, "You just did the best thing you could have done on this entire flight." Ava looked at her, her eyes red with tears. "But I lost everything." Rachel smiled softly. "No, I didn't. You just regained something that many people lose forever, true self-respect." Captain James Adler watched the entire scene through the safety cameras. He sat still, his aging eyes glinting thoughtfully. It was a rare moment of pride, not that he had handled the crisis properly, but that he felt some measure of justice in a profession so accustomed to bowing to process. He whispered, as if talking to himself, "Not everyone has the courage to admit mistakes, especially when the whole world is watching. But it is in that moment that one is liberated." The plane shook slightly. It felt like everything was settling down, not just the pressure, but the moral order had been restored. Ava returned to the cabin, her face calmer, but no longer fearful. There was something new in her eyes, the strange peace of someone who had faced and accepted herself. As the plane began to descend, Ava stared silently out the small window. The city lights were coming into view, bright and still, a reminder that every mistake must eventually land. But sometimes, it is then that one truly begins to learn to fly. The plane was at a steady altitude. The lighting in the first-class cabin dimmed. Everything seemed to return to its original order except the air. It was no longer the gentle luxury it had been, but thick, still, as if something had just been stripped bare. Daniel Cole sat in first class, in the same seat as before, seat 1A. No one guided him, nor did anyone dare. Everyone just stood aside, letting him walk on his own, as if he were returning to his original seat. When he sat down, the flight attendant in that compartment asked softly, "Mr. Cole, would you like some water?" Daniel shook his head, his voice soft and cold. "No, thank you." He opened his laptop and worked, his eyes glued to the screen, not because he had anything urgent to do, but because it was his way of keeping his anger from building up. A few minutes later, Ava Monroe entered the cabin. She stood a few feet away from him, her hands clasped behind her back, her eyes downcast. No one had asked her to come, but she understood sometimes the right thing was the thing no one told her to. She said softly, her voice trembling, "Cole, I wanted to ask if you needed anything else." Daniel looked up, his eyes as calm as water. He didn't ask why she came, didn't ask why she changed her tone. He just looked at her, then said slowly, in a voice that was frighteningly calm, "You've never asked me what I needed before." Just one sentence. But in that moment, Ava felt like she had been slapped, not with a hand, but with a blunt truth that she could not argue with. She opened her mouth to say something, but Daniel turned back to the screen, the light reflected off his face cold, still, and so far away she didn't know where to stand. Having her forgiveness revoked hurt more than being yelled at. Ava stood there for a few more seconds, then stepped back. She turned away, but a void opened up in her heart, heavy and cold. When she entered the cabin, the atmosphere changed dramatically. Rachel Carter looked up, but she didn't smile as she usually did. The other flight attendants glanced at her, then looked away in silence. No one said anything. No one had to say anything. Their looks weren't malicious, but filled with disappointment. And Ava understood. She had lost something a person in her profession should never lose the trust of her colleagues. She sat down on the chair and took a glass of water, but her hands were still shaking. Daniel's words kept ringing in her head, like a constant reminder. "You never asked me what I needed before." A simple sentence, but enough to make her realize she had forgotten that her job was not to classify people, but to serve them with equal respect. Rachel stepped forward, her voice soft. "He's not angry." You see, Ava looked up, her eyes red. "That's why it's scary." "Rachel, anger has a sound, but silence, it makes people face themselves." Rachel didn't reply, just put her hand on her shoulder, then turned away. That small gesture almost made Ava cry, because she knew it wasn't sympathy, but a silent farewell between two people who once stood on the same professional ideals. In first class, Daniel sat still. He didn't look around, didn't act triumphant, but every little action, the way he stayed silent, the way he didn't look at Ava as she passed was a punishment more powerful than any reprimand. An elderly passenger sitting nearby said softly, "I see you are very calm, Mr. Cole." I don't know if I can do that." Daniel smiled slightly, his eyes looking into the distance. When people understand that anger only clouds the mind, they will choose to let the truth speak for itself. The passenger nodded, silent. The whole cabin seemed to agree with that philosophy. Justice sometimes does not need a voice, only the calm of one who has seen through it. Meanwhile, behind her, Ava sat quietly by the cabin door. She looked at the cold glass of water on the table, her heart filled with a mixture of regret, fear, and gratitude. She knew that Daniel could have easily made her lose her job or suspended her the moment the plane landed. But he didn't. And it was his not doing that made her feel suffocated with guilt. Not for being punished, but for being forgiven too soon. Forgiveness, when one is not ready to face it, is the bitterest form of punishment. In the cockpit, Captain Adler turned on the intercom. Hearing the steady hum of the engines like a silent prayer, he whispered to his co-pilot, "Parker, sometimes what changes people is not punishment, but silence at the right time." Parker nodded and replied that silence is heavier than a sentence. "Captain." Adler looked out at the vast sky before him, the light of the setting sun reflecting off the windshield. He knew that one man had just learned the most valuable lesson of his life, and another had just proven that justice and kindness could coexist. As the city lights began to flash below, Ava understood that landing didn't mean the end, because some journeys' inner journeys only truly begin after everything has gone quiet. The sound of the plane's tires lightly grinding on the runway echoed, bringing everyone back to reality. The journey in the sky was about to end, but in the hearts of the Skyjet crew, another journey had just begun, a journey of re-examination and awakening. The cabin lights came on, and passengers were preparing to pack their belongings. But in the service area at the back, where the people in dark blue uniforms were gathered, the atmosphere was still thick and heavy, as if someone had just lost something important that no one dared to mention. Rachel Carter was the first to speak. Her voice was small but firm. Ava touched someone she shouldn't have. That sentence, simple but containing many layers of meaning. An older colleague sighed softly. She forgot that everyone deserves respect. She thinks she is just following the procedure. Rachel looked around, her eyes bright but sad. No, it wasn't procedure, it was prejudice. If she had just treated everyone else the same, none of this would have happened. No one objected. There was only silence between the men who wore the same uniform but no longer felt like they were on the same team. In the far corner, Ava Monroe sat silently. She heard everything but said nothing. Her colleague's voice, once familiar, now seemed to come from a faraway place where she had once stood, once confidently directing them. Now, each whisper felt like a small knife, cutting away at the last shreds of honor. Rachel glanced at Ava. There was no resentment in her eyes, only a vague regret like seeing a once respected friend lose himself. Another flight attendant whispered, "I heard the operations team is waiting at the gate. There are security representatives, too." Another added, "If that's true, then she's done for." The group was silent. No one was happy, no one was gloating, because they all understood a person in the profession who is fired not only loses his job, but also loses his wings, loses the pride that once lifted him to the sky. Ava remained seated, her eyes glued to the floor. She thought back over the years, over the men she had trained and supervised. She had believed that strictness was what made a crew strong. But now, in this cold silence, she realized unfair strictness breeds fear, not respect. Rachel walked slowly over and placed a glass of water in front of her. It was a small gesture, but it made Ava feel breathless. Rachel said nothing, just nodded a wordless goodbye, the way people would say to someone who was about to leave forever. Ava tried to smile, but her lips trembled. "Thank you," Rachel replied, her voice soft. "I don't do it for you. I do it for this job. I don't want us to forget what makes us different from the arrogant." Ava bowed her head, tears falling onto the back of her hands. Not because Rachel was harsh, but because she was telling the truth, a truth she had known, but had long forgotten. In first class, Daniel Cole sat in silence. He was no longer paying attention to the atmosphere around him, but occasionally his eyes would glance back, as if sensing what was happening there. He knew that justice did not need his intervention. It spread on its own, like waves after a stone has been thrown into water. An elderly man sitting near him turned to him and said, "You know, your silence makes them think more than any speech." Daniel just smiled slightly. Sometimes, the only way to make people realize their mistakes is to let them hear their own silence echo. The man nodded, his eyes filled with admiration. Outside, the sun was setting, but its light reflected off Daniel's glasses, a light that was not blinding, but rather a gentle flame of kindness held back after the storm. In the service cabin, another flight attendant, who was usually quiet, sighed softly. Ava used to be the best, but perhaps sometimes it is the best people who easily forget who they were before they were given power. No one responded, but everyone understood. Because in their world, where every behavior is regulated, every smile is measured by standards, the most dangerous thing is when people start to believe that the rules make them superior to others. Ava raised her head and looked around. There were no more friendly eyes, no more familiar greetings. Everyone avoided eye contact with her, not out of hatred, but because they didn't know how to look at her anymore. She was no longer a superior, not quite a colleague. Just a name that had separated from the group, quiet, lonely, and falling behind. An internal announcement rang out all crew members. Prepare for landing and post-flight inspection procedures. Rachel stood up, adjusted her scarf, and whispered to her colleague, "Do the rest well. Don't let someone else's mistake affect us." She walked away, leaving Ava alone in the corner. Ava watched, a forced smile forming and fading. To her, the image of Rachel walking away looked like herself years ago younger, still believing that good people could change the way the world saw respect. The plane's wings gradually descended, shaking slightly. Everything in the cabin was neat and quiet, but in each person's heart, something invisible continued to move. That was awareness. Those who witnessed what happened today will remember it for a long time. Not because it was the airline boss's case, but because they saw with their own eyes the fragile line between power and human dignity. Ava bowed her head and whispered to herself, "Sometimes what makes us lose everything is not the mistake, but the silence when we should have said sorry sooner." When the plane hits the ground and the doors open, Ava knows everything she once knew will be gone. But perhaps it's in that moment where she loses everything that she begins to learn how to be human again. The internal loudspeaker sounded flat and emotionless. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are about to begin our descent. Please return to your seats and fasten your seat belts." In the hold, everyone followed suit, oblivious to Ava Monroe's expression, but in her head, the sound was no longer a safety announcement. It was a bell signaling an impending doom. From first class, Daniel Cole received the last text message on his phone. "Security and operations will be waiting at the gate. Ava Monroe is to report as soon as she lands." He read slowly, the light from the screen reflecting off his calm face. He didn't reply. He just folded the phone, set it on the small table, and looked out the window, where the clouds were breaking into thin strips. Everything outside looked peaceful, but inside, a storm was brewing, not in the sky, but in people's hearts. Ava stood in the back service area. Her hands gripped the edge of the metal table, her knuckles white. She had landed hundreds of times, but time had never felt so slow. Every sound was amplified, the thump of tires, the revving of engines, the rattle of glasses to the vibrations of the fuselage. The world seemed to remind her that, no matter how hard she tried to stay calm, everything was falling apart. A colleague approached, trying to whisper, "Ava, are you okay?" Ava nodded slightly, her lips pressed tightly together, but that nod could not hide her panicked eyes, filled with a fear she did not dare to name. She knew things had gotten out of hand. It was no longer a technical error. It was no longer a misunderstanding between the passenger and the flight attendant. It was a rift in the airline's reputation, and she would be the first to be held responsible, in first class. Daniel felt the change in the atmosphere. He heard no more apologies, saw no sign of Ava or Rachel. Only the white light of the cabin shone on his face, cold and soft, as if justice were closing its circle. He let out a small breath, not of relief, but of the knowledge that the lesson had served its purpose. He needed no further words. The silence was enough for the world to right itself. An elderly passenger sitting nearby turned and said, "Cole, are you planning to make a big deal out of this?" Daniel shook his head slightly. "I don't need to do anything. The truth speaks for itself." Meanwhile, behind her, Ava heard the loudspeaker blaring again. "Prepare for landing. Please remain seated." She tried to take a deep breath, straighten her bow tie, straighten her uniform, but each small gesture made her feel more and more alienated from herself. The uniform she had once been so proud of now felt like a cloak of judgment. She remembered the morning she looked in the mirror before leaving home. Everything was perfect, neat hair, even lipstick, professional smile. No one could have imagined that, just a few hours later, that image would be shattered. Rachel stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "They'll be waiting at the gate." "I heard." Ava nodded, her eyes still fixed on him. "I know, and I imagine Mr. Cole knows, too." Rachel hesitated. "He doesn't want revenge." Ava smiled tiredly. Sometimes, not taking revenge is the fastest way to make people collapse. In that moment, Ava felt it clearly. Every look in the compartment was a silent indictment. No one criticized, no one said anything, but she knew everyone knew, and that was what she feared most, being seen, not with contempt, but with silence. The plane hovered gently. From the small window, the city lights gradually appeared, patches of light blurred in the mist, like countless eyes looking up, witnessing her journey to her own end. She took a deep breath and whispered in her heart, "I used to think I could fly high because I was better than others. But it turns out I can only fly high if I respect others." The plane touched down. A slight bounce, then a slow roll down the runway. The engine noise faded, but Ava's heart was still pounding in her chest, faster than ever. Sweat beaded on her hands, cold. Rachel glanced at her and said softly, "Keep your spirits up." Ava only responded with a wry smile. She knew the advice came from a good place, but she also knew that no spirit could be strong when everything that once supported you had turned into a crumbling cliff. She adjusted the nameplate, Ava Monroe, the metal glinting in the cabin lights. In a few minutes, that name would be heard in the Skyjet boardroom, not in honor, but in closure. The cargo door swung open. Light from outside flooded in, blinding. Ava saw through the small window 3 people were waiting at the end of the tube 2 in security uniforms. One in a gray executive suit. She recognized them immediately. She didn't need anyone to tell her where to go, what to say, but just then, as she stepped out of the cabin, she saw Daniel stand up and turn around. His eyes were not cold, not angry, just a calm look, like one watching a storm pass. She bowed her head slightly. There were no words left to say. And in that bow, she felt more clearly than ever every mistake has its price. But sometimes, the biggest price is to keep calm when facing the consequences of your own actions. As the compartment door closed behind her, Ava heard her own footsteps echoing on the metal bridge. Each step echoed in her heart. Outside, the storm was over, but inside her, it was still screaming, demanding an answer to the age-old question, why do people only learn respect after they've lost it? The air in the cabin became thick after the final brake click. The Skyjet SJ-204 stopped on the runway, the engine still roaring softly, like the heartbeat of a body that had just survived a storm. The airport lights streamed in from the windows, pale yellow and cold. Passengers began to unbuckle their seat belts. The clanking of metal mingled with faint whispers. No one spoke loudly, but everyone knew something unusual had just ended. In the front row, Daniel Cole stood up. He was slow, unhurried. His shirt was still pressed, his slight smile still in place, as if he had never been demeaned, had never been ejected from his seat because of his skin color and plain shirt. At the back of the cabin, Ava Monroe waited, half stiff, half trembling. She had taken off her name tag and hidden it in her pocket. No one had asked her to, but she couldn't bear to see the metal reflecting off her face. She knew Daniel would pass. She didn't know whether to look or avoid him, and then, as he approached, all the sounds around her stopped, only the soft click of his footsteps on the floor of the plane, a steady, quiet beat of justice. Ava looked up, her eyes wet. Daniel stopped, not far, not close, just enough for her to see his eyes clearly calm, not angry, not pitying, just a very strange light, cold and bright like a mirror. He spoke softly, his voice so soft that only she could hear. Next time, check the ticket before you check the person. The sentence, short, soft, but falling like a complete sentence. No shout, no insult, no exclamation point, just a piece of advice, uttered by someone who was once considered inferior to someone who once believed himself superior. Ava stood still. Her lip trembled, but she couldn't say anything. In that moment, she knew any apologies were too late. Daniel kept walking. He didn't turn around, but the passengers nearby fell silent, as if they had just witnessed something more than a conversation, a moment of status exchange that didn't require noise. A middle-aged woman, sitting in row 2B, whispered to her husband, "That's not just for her, but for all of us." The husband nodded, his eyes thoughtful. Yes, How many times in our lives have we checked people before seeing their tickets? The words rang out softly, but they seemed to linger on the echoes of the sentence Daniel had just pronounced. Not just for Ava, but for all those who had ever used prejudice to measure people. Captain Adler waited at the door of the cabin. He had received a message from headquarters. Operations is on the gangway. Report after passengers disembark. As Daniel approached, Adler inclined his head slightly, his voice respectful. "Mr. Cole, it was a pleasure to have you on board today." Daniel nodded slightly. "Thank you, Captain, and thank you for keeping things on track." The two men shook hands, briefly but firmly. No need for extra words because Adler understood. The man before him was not only the boss of the company, but also a living lesson in honorable composure. Behind her, Ava stood still, watching the scene. No one told her to stay, but her feet felt glued to the floor. She watched Daniel leave the plane, walking straight, each step calm, never looking back. In her eyes, he was the image of a man who had won, but did not need a loser. As he disappeared through the door, Ava heard the intercom ring out, "Crew, thank you for a safe flight." Those familiar words, for the first time in years, made her cry. Not because of safety, but because she understood. Safety does not mean no harm. 2 security guards and an executive officer boarded the plane. One of them whispered to Ava, "Miss Monroe, please come with us. The management wants to see you right away." She nodded, not resisting. Bending down, she took off her white gloves, carefully folded them and placed them on the chair, as if in a farewell ritual. The silver ring on her hand lightly hit the table, creating a small, cold sound, the sound of a moment of parting between a human and the illusion of power. Rachel stood nearby, not daring to say a word. As Ava passed by, she only whispered, "I believe in one day you will understand the true meaning of service." Ava paused for a second, smiling sadly. Maybe today is that day. Then she walked away. Outside, the wind blew in from the hallway, carrying the chill of the night. Ava stepped off the plane, saw Daniel talking to the airline representative, then left with his personal bodyguard. He didn't turn back, but in her heart, his words still echoed clearly, like a note repeating over and over in her mind. "Check the ticket before you check the person." Each word was a sharp but fair knife, not stabbing into the body, but carving into the consciousness. She knew no apology could change the outcome, but it could start again from the exact spot where she had stumbled. In the empty cabin, Captain Adler walked over to the last row and whispered to Rachel, "You see, sometimes justice doesn't need police or courts. It just needs someone to say the right thing at the right time." Rachel nodded, looking out the window where the airport lights were fading, and the other person must be brave enough to listen. Adler smiled slightly. Then he turned off the cabin lights and closed the door. The flight ended, but the story of how a single word can change a person's perception still lingers somewhere in the air where silent justice flies. The sentence leading to the conclusion. As the runway lights receded, Daniel understood that sometimes the most profound lesson lies not in anger, but in the ability to let others hear their own conscience. And for Ava, this flight was not just an end, but the beginning of an awakening. The sound of the glass door closing behind Ava Monroe was crisp, like the sealing of a chapter in life. The Skyjet Airlines conference room was eerily quiet. The air was too fresh. The leather chairs gleamed. The glass walls reflected a pale yellow light. She sat across from 3 men in gray suits, senior executives of the airline. On the table, in front of each of them, was a file, and in each file, she knew her name was on it. One of them, with silver hair and a deep voice, spoke first, Miss Monroe. "Do you understand why you are here?" Ava tried to keep her composure. Her voice remained professional, as if she were serving passengers on a flight. "I believe this is just a misunderstanding. About seating. Gentlemen." The passenger did not. The man interrupted, not loudly but firmly. "It's not a misunderstanding. Miss Monroe, it's judging the wrong person, for the wrong reason, with the wrong attitude." 3 pairs of eyes turned to her at once. There was no anger in them, just the look of people who had seen more mistakes than excuses. The room fell silent. The clock on the wall ticked so clearly that Ava lost the right to defend herself. She tried to open her mouth. "I didn't mean to offend him. I was just following the rules." I thought. Another, younger person interrupted. "You think he doesn't deserve to sit in first class?" Just because of his plain appearance, Ava bowed her head. For the first time in her life, as a flight attendant, she couldn't respond with a polite smile or a businesslike argument. Because this time, they were right. One of the 3 directors opened the file. His voice was even, reciting the facts as if reading a weather report, objective, accurate, but cold today. On flight SJ-204 Ms. Monroe asked passenger Daniel Cole to leave first class without checking his ticket information. She did so based on personal judgment, not professional basis. That passenger, as she knew, is the owner of Skyjet Airlines. Ava looked up, trying to speak. I had no idea who he was. The silver-haired man interrupted again, softly and coldly, and that's the problem. You don't need to know who he is to treat him properly. His position has nothing to do with how you should behave. The point is, you only need to see a person, but you only see a prejudice. Ava sat still, her hands clasped together. Her thumbs trembled as she gently brushed against the slightly chipped nail polish. That small detail, strangely enough, made her feel naked. No longer chief stewardess Ava Monroe, just a woman trying to save some dignity after losing it. She said softly, "As if in a last-ditch effort, I have worked here for 14 years. I have never made a major mistake. The young director interrupted, his voice restrained but clear. 14 years without making a mistake does not give you the right to make a mistake like this. A representative of Skyjet is not allowed to define the dignity of a passenger by appearance or profession." He paused, then added slowly, "You didn't just offend one person. You brought the whole company down." The conference room fell silent again. Ava felt her back pressed against the chair, her heart pounding so hard it made her breath catch. She looked around. Everything was as still as stone. Only the clock on the wall continued to tick, 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 tick. Each tick seemed to count down to what she feared most. The silver-haired man finally closed the file, his voice low after reviewing the entire situation. "The board of directors has decided to terminate Ms. Monroe's employment, effective immediately. No argument, no one said anything more, just one sentence, short and concise, summed up her 14 years. Ava stared at the glass table in front of her, where the light reflected her small, blurry, distorted. She wanted to say, "I'm sorry," but her throat felt tight. She couldn't form a single word. not because of pride, but because she knew it wasn't time to apologize, not until she had come to terms with what she had truly done. 1 second, 2 seconds. She stood up slowly, bowing deeply. No one responded, but there was no need, because in the world of people who are used to keeping professional masks, silence is the last language of shame. As she stepped out of the conference room, the light from the hallway made her squint. Her high heels made a dry, drawn-out clunk, like a string of periods between ending and regret. Outside, she saw Rachel waiting, leaning lightly against the wall, her eyes sad but non-judgmental. Rachel asked softly, "How are you?" Ava just shook her head, a forced smile. "It's over, but at least they were right." Rachel was silent for a moment, then said, "Perhaps sometimes losing one's position is not as scary as realizing that one has forgotten how to be human." Ava looked at her, her eyes blurred with tears. The words, simple but painful, because they hit her right where she was broken. As they walked out into the hallway, Ava saw Daniel Cole at the end of the hall. He was talking to Captain Adler, his voice low and calm as usual. He didn't look at her, but Ava paused, as if to thank him with her eyes for not turning her anger into revenge. In that moment, she understood justice is not an explosion, but a closed circle, where the wrongdoer must hear the echo of his own actions. And that circle had just closed around her, gently but unbreakably. As Ava stepped out of the building, the cold night wind blew, carrying the notice of dismissal from her hand. The paper flew away, circling in the air, and then fell to the ground, a full stop to an old chapter. But inside her, something had begun, another, deeper, more real silence called awareness. The termination papers lay before Ava Monroe, neat and cold, a simple piece of paper with only a few lines of neatly printed words, but each word seemed to weigh as much as a year of the 14 years she had spent her youth at Skyjet Airlines. She held the pen. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from realization this was not just an administrative signature, but the boundary between two people, the one who once had the power to give orders, and the one who was about to return to ordinary life, forgotten by everyone. She signed slowly Ava Monroe. The familiar name had been printed on name tags, on crew chiefs' lists, on internal commendations. Now it lay quietly beneath the words, "Termination effective." Immediately, a person from the Human Resources Department approached, his voice low and emotionless. "Thank you. Ms. Monroe, please collect your personal belongings. Security will escort you to the internal exit." The thank you sounded hollow and robotic. She nodded. "Thank you," but no one knew what she was thanking for. The conference room door closed behind her. Ava stepped out into the hallway, long and bright, the fluorescent lights reflecting off the polished floor. She had walked down that hallway hundreds of times, walked confidently, greeted, respected, told, "Good shift, Chief," every morning. Today, everything was silent. No one greeted her, no smiles returned, only the sound of her own heels dry, echoing, and lost. At the turn, she saw a large photograph hanging on the wall, the crew from the previous year at the airline's anniversary celebration. She stood in the middle of it, smiling brightly, her uniform pressed. Next to her, Rachel Carter, then a new flight attendant, looked at her with admiration. Ava paused for a long time, not to reminisce but to understand that all glory, if not supported by character, will crumble under the weight of arrogance. 2 security guards followed, keeping a safe distance. No one spoke. Ava slowed down, feeling the cold wind that crept through the cracks in the door, carrying with it the smell of plastic and metal, the smell of the airport, of machinery, of the world she was about to leave. When she reached the exit, one of them opened the door for her, saying politely, "This way, Miss Monroe." She replied softly, "Thank you," a simple thank you. But it resonated differently, because for the first time in her career, Ava truly understood the meaning of saying thank you. Outside, the sky was a dull, heavy gray. The wind blew from the runway, cold and dry. She stopped, pulling her small suitcase, the suitcase that had accompanied her through dozens of countries, through long flights. The label still had the word crew priority on it. She stared at it for a long time, then slowly peeled it off. The label was torn in half, leaving a small piece of it. A young employee passed by and recognized her. His eyes were confused, as if he wanted to say something, but he just bowed slightly. She smiled back, a soft smile, without defense, without authority. The smile of someone who had lost everything, but was beginning to see others. She walked through the lobby. Everything felt unfamiliar. The rows of chairs where she had once sat approving flight schedules for her subordinates were now silent, almost mocking. The glass wall overlooking the runway reflected her silhouette, a small, pale silhouette, lost in the light. Each step dragged on like a countdown. She remembered Daniel Cole's words, "Next time, check the ticket before you check the person." At the time, she thought it was a reprimand, but now it rang in her head as a reminder of how to live. Not check your ticket, but check your heart before judging others. The last door opened, the one used by employees to exit the administrative area. A strong wind blew in, whipping her hair, making her shiver. The light outside was so bright that she had to shield her eyes. It was the light of freedom, but also the light of emptiness. She dragged her suitcase across the parking lot, each wheel clacking loudly on the cracked cement. Across the street, a large sign read "Skyjet, fly above the rest." She looked at the slogan and let out a small laugh, a sarcastic laugh. Then it turned to sadness, because in her 14 years of flying above the rest, she had never thought that flying high was not about position, but about how you treat others. She got to the car. She put her suitcase in the trunk, sat still, and didn't start the engine. Her hands were on the steering wheel, her eyes staring out the windshield. Outside, a Skyjet plane had just taken off. The engine roared, trailing white smoke. Ava watched it, her eyes blurred by the wind. Now, that plane no longer carried her. But deep down, she knew it had just taken away the last remnants of her pride. A notification came from the phone message from unknown number. "I hope you're okay. Rachel." Ava smiled. It was a short message, but for her, it was the first small rope pulling her out of the abyss of sin. Because in this judgmental world, there was still someone kind enough to ask. "Are you okay?" She typed back, "Not okay yet, but I'm learning to be okay." Then she put down the phone and started the car. The engine hummed softly, blending with the sound of the wind outside. The car rolled, slowly leaving the parking lot like a molted bird trying to fly again. On the way out of the airport, Ava turned on the radio. An old jazz song played, rustic and full of nostalgia. She realized that there are journeys not in the sky, but in people's hearts, where we learn to fly again, without wings. The late afternoon rain poured down on Skyjet International Airport, heavy and thick, as if the sky itself were trying to wash away the traces of human error. In the old car parked on the side of the road, Ava Monroe sat still, watching each drop of water hit the windshield and dissolve into wet streaks. She had been sitting there for over an hour, not because she had nowhere to go, but because she had no idea where she belonged. The phone on the seat beside her kept vibrating. Not a call, just a notification from the company's internal chat groups. Her name appeared in the title of a post-chief flight attendant, Ava Monroe, the woman who insulted the owner of Skyjet. The text was cold, dry, but like a knife. She clicked on it, then exited immediately. She didn't need to read the comments. She could already guess criticism, sarcasm, pity, and a few served it right, mixed in with the hundreds of laughing emojis. She tried calling Linda, her best colleague from years of working together. It rang for a long time, then went to voicemail. Then Mark, her old supervisor, who had said she was the backbone of the flight crew, still no answer. Ava watched the screen fade, the blue light reflecting in her tired eyes. She knew bad news traveled faster than the truth. The wind howled loudly in the parking lot, inside the car. The cold seeped through the cracks in the windows, making her shiver. She remembered the looks on the passengers on her old flights, the black woman who asked for an extra blanket and was ignored because she thought she was annoying. The boy in a black hoodie who was told to sit up straight because it was not polite. All those moments suddenly appeared in slow motion, every small action, every careless word, every time she thought she was right. Now, turned away from the entire industry, she understood that she was experiencing the same feeling she had inflicted on others, judged without being heard, defined without being able to explain. She opened her phone and found an old message from Rachel Carter, the young colleague who had told her that day. Perhaps losing one's position is not as scary as forgetting how to be a human being. Ava read it again, then nodded slightly. The words suddenly became a guide to her thoughts. She realized that, over the years, she'd grown accustomed to using the smile of power, a polite, empty smile, not to comfort anyone, but to remind others that she was superior. And now, when that smile no longer had any meaning, she had learned to smile for real. It was still raining. She decided to get out of the car and walk into the small café in the old train station. The place was almost empty, except for a few customers and the radio broadcasting the weather report. The waitress, a young, dark-skinned woman, smiled slightly as she asked, "What would you like?" Ava replied softly. "A cup of black coffee. No sugar?" The girl nodded and turned away. Ava watched, recognizing in that smile something she had missed, the gentleness of respect. When the coffee cup was put down, she whispered, "Thank you." Not the thank you of someone being served, but the thank you of someone who had just been given the chance to be a normal person again. In the corner of the shop, a wall-mounted TV was broadcasting the news. Skyjet Airlines confirms the incident between Chief Flight Attendant Ava Monroe and passenger Daniel Cole, the airline's owner. The company affirms that no one, regardless of position, is allowed to behave disrespectfully towards customers. The announcer's voice was steady, emotionless, but each word drilled into Ava's ears. She didn't look up. She just closed her eyes and listened to the news until the last line. When she opened her eyes, the coffee was cold. She picked up the cup and looked at the layer of steam still lingering around the rim of the cup. as hazy as her image in the eyes of others at that moment, dissolved and clear at the same time. Outside, a plane took off. The roar of the engines stretched across the gray sky. Ava watched, no longer in pain. She understood that there were flights she wasn't allowed on, not because there weren't enough seats, but because she wasn't humble enough to sit. Her phone lit up again. A new email had arrived from an unexpected address, from Daniel Cole, subject Skyjet, a lesson learned. I have no intention of ruining your career, Ava, but there are lessons that only come when one has the courage to fall. I believe you will get back up if you choose to learn the right things. Ava read it over and over, no accusation, no angry tone, just a reminder calm, but it made her heart flutter. She typed a line again, briefly, "Thank you. Mr. Cole, I learned it." Then she pressed send, without hesitation. That evening, when she returned to her small apartment, she opened the closet and took out her old uniform, the navy blue suit she had once loved. She smoothed out the creases and hung it up neatly, not out of regret, but as a way to return the memory to the past. In the mirror, her face looked different, lighter, more real, though still tired. She looked at herself and smiled slightly. Perhaps, for the first time in many years, I've learned to bow my head without feeling small. That night, the city outside the window sparkled. Ava sat by the window, listening to the planes streak across the sky. This time, she didn't feel jealous, only peaceful. Because sometimes, justice isn't about flying high, but about learning to stand up after falling. Night fell on the highway connecting the airport and the city center. Street lights stretched into long, dim streaks of light, sliding past the car windows like newly washed memories. Daniel Cole sat in the back seat, wearing a white shirt and a loose tie. He leaned his head back, looking out the window at the light reflecting off his calm face. Next to him, Mark Bennett, his longtime assistant, held an iPad, a list of news stories about the incident that had spread throughout the aviation world. Mark sighed softly. "The news is everywhere, sir. The press is calling this Skyjet's historic incident." Daniel smiled slightly, not happy, not angry, just the smile of someone who is used to the noise of the world. He replied, "People always like stories where someone is wrong and someone is right, Mark. But in fact, in life, it is rare for anyone to be completely right." The car drove silently through the night, the sound of the engine mixed with the wind outside the window, like the background music for a conversation that neither of them wanted to start, but both needed. Mark looked over, his voice cautious. "I'm just afraid you're being too lenient. She insulted you in front of the passengers and then embarrassed the whole airline." Daniel still didn't look up, just answered slowly, "I don't want revenge. I just want people to learn a lesson about respect." Mark was silent for a moment, then asked, "Do you think she will learn?" Daniel raised his head, his gaze fixed on the distance, where the city lights were gradually appearing on the horizon. He replied, his voice low and calm, "I don't know, but at least now she understands the feeling of being judged for her appearance, and if she truly understands that, then she's already halfway through her change." The car turned onto the highway, passing a giant billboard bearing the Skyjet Airlines logo glowing in the dark. The light reflected off Daniel's face, highlighting his eyes, which held a philosophy of life that he did not need to express. He started at the bottom, an airport technician. He knew the smell of oil, the feeling of being yelled at for looking like a mechanic, and what it was like to be ignored when wearing a dusty uniform. It was those years that he would never forget. A person's dignity is not in their uniform, but in how they treat others. Mark still looked at him, half surprised, half admiring. "You're really different, Daniel. Someone else in your position would have made her lose the chance to raise her head." Daniel replied softly, "If you make others bow their heads out of fear, they will only hate you. But if you make them bow their heads because they realize they are wrong, they will remember you for the rest of their lives." Mark was silent. For a moment, all that was left was the patter of rain on the hood of the car, a low but steady sound, like the rhythm of a lesson sinking in. In another corner of the city, Ava Monroe sat in her small apartment, looking out the window, seeing the distant headlights reflected on the glass. She did not know that, on a parallel road, the man she had offended was talking about her with surprising calm. She only knew, in her heart, something was changing, a small wind, but real. Daniel's car stopped in front of the hotel where he was staying. He took the cup of coffee from Mark's hand, took a sip, and said, "Mark, you know, power is temporary. With just a gust of wind, it can change direction. But respect and fairness are different. They are the only things that remain when all the glory is gone." Mark nodded, saying nothing more. He understood, having followed Daniel long enough to know this man didn't need to teach anyone. He just lived in a way that made others look back at themselves. When Mark got out of the car, Daniel stayed there for a while. He looked out the window. The night sky was cloudy, moonless, only a few stars twinkling in the distance. A plane was taking off, leaving a thin trail of light in the sky. He watched it, exhaled softly, his voice almost a prayer. Hopefully she will fly again, but this time with wings of understanding. He put down his coffee cup, leaned his head back in his chair, and closed his eyes. In that silence, justice was no longer a judgment. It was a quiet acceptance that anyone could make a mistake, as long as they knew how to correct it. The next morning, the morning news on the radio carried a comment by an old reporter. The Skyjet story is more than just a professional scandal. It is a mirror of how people see each other, with their eyes and their hearts. Today, we judge someone. Tomorrow we may be judged. And if there is one lesson to remember, it is this: respect costs nothing, but the lack of it can cost everything. Upstairs, Daniel Cole quietly turned off the radio. He stood by the window, looking out at the runway as the sun rose. Warm yellow light streamed through the glass, illuminating the small badge on his shirt, the Skyjet logo etched in silver. He smiled slightly, not out of pride, but out of peace, because he knew true justice does not need applause. It only requires someone patient enough not to retaliate, and someone brave enough to admit their mistakes. Power can change places in a moment, but respect, if built on kindness and wisdom, will withstand all the winds of life. Because justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just two people looking at each other and realizing they should have treated each other better. The story. The flight attendant refused to teach her a seat without knowing that he was the owner of the airline is not only an unexpected situation on a flight, but also a mirror of how people treat each other in everyday life. It reminds us that all judgments based on appearance are wrong. A disrespectful word can cost us more than we think, not only our job, but also our personality. In life, we are often so busy that we forget that every person we meet has a story. The person who seems plain today may be the one in power tomorrow, and the person we once looked down on may be the one who helps us grow. True justice is not punishment. It is the moment when we are humble enough to admit when we are wrong and kind enough not to retaliate. If you've ever been wronged, remember, silence and wisdom are sometimes the strongest answers. And if you've ever taken someone for granted, let this story remind you that respect costs nothing, but the lack of it can cost everything. Thank you for listening to the end of the story. If you feel the meaning of this lesson, please click, like, share the video to spread the message of respect, and subscribe to the channel to explore more humane stories with us, where justice does not need to be noisy, just needs a heart that knows how to listen.